Hello, I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. My guest today, William K. Black. He's a professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He also is a former banking regulator. He was at the very top of the savings and loan crisis and settling that, the crisis of the 80s and the settlement of it in the mid-90s. William Black, thank you for being here on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk about, one of your pet peeves is, and mine too, is the total lack of prosecution. The latest to get a big giant pass out of the Justice Department, Goldman Sachs, everybody rigged the mortgage market. I mean, they sold liar loans, they packaged liar loans into securities, they rated them AAA when they were toxic, and when it all blew up, they committed a perjury and forgery, and nobody is going to jail. What do you make of this?
Well, no elites are going to jail. Some regular homeowner types who got caught up, who may be, guilty and may not be guilty, are going to jail. But you're quite right. Nobody in Wall Street that had any major role in causing the crisis through fraud is even being indicted.
Absolutely. It was Wall Street's fault.
It was Wall Street's fault, and Wall Street drove it through not simply misconduct, but outright fraud, hyperinflated the bubble, and caused the financial crisis that caused this great recession. And they're able to do it now with impunity.
Isn't that sad? You had said that this is 70 times larger than the savings and loan crisis. Is that still a good number?
70 times larger.
70, yes, correct. And back in your day,
yeah.
Back in your day, and as you were a top regulator for the government, we had 10,000 indictments and more than 1,000 successful prosecutions. Is that right?
No, it's actually in some ways better than what you say. We had something like 3,000 convictions. But in cases designated as major, which is the ones you want to focus on, there were over 1,000 felony convictions. And they did not take 3,000 indictments to produce that. We had a 90% conviction rate against the most elite defendants who have the best criminal defense lawyers in the world, and they spend money like water to stay out of prison. So it really was a remarkable success by a combination of the regulators and the FBI and the Justice Department.
And how many financial elites have gone in this crisis, which is 70 times larger? How many have gone to jail?
None.
I mean, has the government turned into a fascist state or a kleptocracy in your mind?
Well, I think the government is aptly characterized as, at a minimum, slipping into American style of crony capitalism, where the elites get together with the corrupt politicians. They guarantee what we call in both economics and criminology a sure thing. And that's what accounting fraud is. You are mathematically guaranteed, if you follow the recipe that optimizes accounting fraud, to report record, albeit fictional, profits with modern executive compensation. That means you are wealthy within a year or two. And then the place fails, but in the modern era, it's often bailed out. And whether or not it's bailed out, you walk away rich.
Tell me about this latest story that broke on Reuters. They're talking about how the banks have these living wills, these resolution plans, recovery plans, and the regulators are telling them that they have to maybe sell off assets and find other forms of funding. I mean, didn't the Fed and the government come in because there were no lenders? I mean, isn't this a pipe dream that they're pushing on the banks, the five biggest banks, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citi, Bank of America? I'm leaving one out, but isn't this a pipe dream that these banks, if they get in trouble, they're going to find other forms of funding and sell off their profitable businesses?
We've all seen this. This is watch my left hand, watch my left hand, watch my left hand, because all the business is happening with the right hand. These so-called living wills are absolutely useless. Everybody knows they're absolutely useless. Nobody can predict how the crisis will evolve, what markets will be like in those circumstances. So the idea that you could actually use a plan like this once you got into the crisis is ridiculous. Everybody knows it's ridiculous. But the bigger fraud, again, is this, watch this hand. This is being sold as too big to fail. And it does no such thing. It doesn't allow them at all. And in fact, we made the largest entities bigger after this crisis, even though they were already too big to jail and too big to manage. So there's one of the classic win-win-wins available to us. And the fact that Dodd-Frank didn't take advantage of that potential win-win-win shows you, how misdesigned that legislation was. So the first win was if you shrank these huge banks, these systemically dangerous institutions, you would dramatically reduce systemic risk, which should be our biggest priority. They didn't. Second big win is that these companies would actually be much more efficient if they were smaller, because you can see with all this stuff at J.P. Morgan with its huge losses, and Jamie Dimon saying, well, I can't possibly run the place, right? It's too big. I can't know what's happening in a $250 billion investment portfolio. I just sort of listen to what people tell me is happening. All right, so you would have a much more efficient bank if you shrank it. And the third big win, of course, is you could attempt to restore democracy as a more functional form to the United States, because you would dramatically reduce crony capitalism. And crony capitalism always not only ruins any pretense of a free market, it also ruins any pretense of a free democracy.
And coming back to this this point about Goldman, yet another bank, they're basically going to get a free pass. What do you think about that on the mortgage arena?
Yeah, so to come back to these systemically dangerous institutions. First, of course, they get now an explicit federal subsidy. That's called deposit insurance. But far larger is the implicit federal subsidy of too big to fail. Now, a word of explanation. That phrase is a misnomer. It doesn't mean the institution can't fail. Look at Bear Stearns, look at Merrill Lynch, look at Lehman Brothers. What it means is that when we resolve a failure that huge, you pay the general creditors in full instead of what you would normally do in a bankruptcy, which is they only get paid to the extent their assets, pro rata in jargon, right? So if you pay the creditors in full, and if you know that they're going to pay the creditors in full because they fear the cascade failures through the banking system, then of course you can borrow more cheaply. That's a huge federal implicit off the budget federal subsidy to all the systemically dangerous institutions. So if you're from the conservative perspective and you hate Fannie and Freddie for what you view as their role, well, then you should hate J.P. Morgan and the others for exactly the same reason, because they have exactly the same implicit federal subsidy. So very conservative authors, economists at NYU recently published a book, Guaranteed to Fail, about Fannie and Freddie primarily, but they make this point that any of these systemically dangerous institutions have this implicit federal subsidy and that it destroys any ability to have free markets. Their metaphor is that, or simile, is that this is like bringing a gun to a knife fight, so that nobody can really compete with the J.P. Morgans of the world, and we don't want that. We can't have that and have a functioning market system.
Well, you said these banks can still fail, and what I'm hearing from a lot of people, I just talked to people like Eric Sprott, I've talked to people like Gerald Celente, I've talked to Jim Rickards, and they all say that another calamity bigger than the last one, even Peter Schiff, can happen. We could have a systemic failure. What's your view of this?
Oh, absolutely. what I primarily try to study, and of course recommend policies to stop, is the question, why do we have recurrent, intensifying financial crises? So of course that's really two questions. One, what's causing them? And the second is, why don't we learn from the past crisis and take steps to prevent the next one? Because instead, each crisis is becoming bigger by an order of magnitude. So you go from the savings and loan debacle, which was $150 billion roughly, to the Enron era frauds, where in conjunction with the collapse of the high-tech boom, the market cap loss was $6 to $7 billion. Here, just the household sector lost $11 trillion. A trillion is 1,000 billion. And so if this gets bigger by an order of magnitude again, and yes, it can do so, especially if they're able to commit these frauds with impunity, then you can get to the point where even the United States will be thrown in just a long-term collapse scenario instead of the scenario we are now, which is similar to the lost decade of Japan.
Do you think that another collapse, some people say that we still are in the same collapse since 2008, that we just softened it and we just prolonged it, that we're still in a collapse. Do you think the next collapse is going to be worse, and do you think it's imminent?
I don't think that we're in a collapse. I think the numbers are fairly clear that we're not in a collapse. We're in a very weak recovery, right? And a very fragile recovery. And you've seen Europe. So Europe ran an experiment. In jargon in science, we call this a natural experiment. No one planned it this way, but the U.S. and Europe have followed very different policies. And so Europe has gone not whole hog with austerity, but pretty darn close to it. And as a result, it has caused a resumption of a full-fledged crisis. Indeed, it's worse. The 2.0 version is worse than the 1.0 version in the periphery. And so nations like Greece and like Spain are in not recessions, but Great Depression levels of unemployment, and unemployment is growing in both of those nations. And when Spain, which was not a country that was running big deficits, right? It was in fact running surpluses in a number of years. Spanish austerity. So you try to balance the budget, right? You have a really big deficit because the recession became a depression, and over 25% of people lose their jobs, right? Obviously, income falls to the government in these circumstances, and you get a really big deficit. So what do you try to do? You try to raise your taxes and you cut your spending. But if you raise your taxes, what happens to private sector demand? Well, it's almost certainly going to fall, and private sector demand, if you're in a depression, definitionally is already deeply inadequate. So they did it, and it fell even more. And you cut simultaneously public spending. Well, what does that do to public sector demand? Well, that cut public sector demand. So overall, what happened to their budget deficit when they did these things? The budget deficit grew, right? So this is, you get really perverse economic circumstances, and this is why almost everybody had figured out, and it worked empirically, that you needed counter-cyclical fiscal policies, right? And austerity is not counter-cyclical. It doesn't fight the cycle. It intensifies the recession. So at least we have avoided those policies to date in the United States, and that's why we have not been thrown back into a really severe worsening of circumstances. But it is just a weak and fragile recovery.
So you think that that there is a possibility we could have another calamity coming up, though? I mean, if there's war in the Middle East?
Whether or not the United States goes back into recession in a year and a half is not the issue in terms of what we've been discussing in terms of systemic risk. We have done next to nothing to remove the key environmental circumstances that create the perverse incentives that drive these crises. And so, in fact, we have pretty much optimized the world, not just the United States, for these kind of systemic crises. How do we do that? Well, the first thing we do is the 3 Ds: deregulation, desupervision, and de facto decriminalization. That's what we've been discussing. The fact that even the worst of the worst, the Countrywide, the WAMUs, the Goldman Sachs, no even serious investigation, much less prosecution, right? And we still have regulatory leaders like Mary Shapiro of the Securities and Exchange Commission, who was appointed to that position because she had a lifetime of service as a failed regulator, right? She'd been running FINRA and such during the entire crisis, a complete abject failure. Who else did we have that were complete abject failures as regulators because they didn't believe in regulation? Well, we had Tim Geithner, head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was supposed to regulate the largest banks in the world, utterly failed to do so. And we had Ben Bernanke, head of the only entity that had the statutory authority under the Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act of 1994 to stop fraudulent liar's loans from being made by entities that did not have federal deposit insurance, which was by far the bulk of the folks who were making the liar's loans, purchasing the liar's loans, rebundling the liar's loans as collateralized debt obligations, right? So only the Fed could have prevented this crisis. And people went, by both parties, and by the way, including groups like the NAACP and like Acorn went to the Fed and said, you've got to stop these loans. They're pervasively fraudulent. They're going to produce a disaster. And Alan Greenspan refused because, as we know, he infamously didn't believe that fraud could exist, that markets just automatically excluded fraud, even though he had been the lead outside expert for Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings, saw all those frauds, and was used by Keating to personally recruit the 5 senators who became known as the Keating Five. But he ignored all of those things, absolutely refused to use that authority. Bernanke refused to use that authority. Complete disaster as a regulator, leads to the biggest financial crisis in 75 years in America, and he's a partisan Republican. What does the new Democratic President Obama do? Takes Tim Geithner, who is a Republican, fig leaf, he's become an independent, and made him his Treasury Secretary, and Ben Bernanke, he reappoints to the Federal Reserve. So in this context, you can't blame partisanship. You have a Democratic president putting prominent Republicans in charge of the financial entities because they've been disasters. And what you're seeing, of course, is bringing us back to crony capitalism. Both parties are in thrall to big finance, which is the leading source of financial contributions for both parties. So though that could change with some of this mega money in the current presidential contest, which comes from folks like casino operators, as we know.
So could something like war in the Middle East cause the financial system to implode with all this leverage and all these derivatives out there?
Yes, is the answer. But in some ways, the answer is different, as we can't really guess what it is that will be the trigger. Once you have a whole system built on a slope that is subject to falling, it could fall because you had an earthquake. It could fall because you had a big rainstorm. It could fall because you had a fire that took away a lot of the trees that were holding together the hillside. We don't know what's going to trigger it, but we can't live on the hillside where it's just a matter of time until the whole thing comes crashing down. So we need to fix and remove the perverse incentives, the three Ds, the deregulation, desupervision, de facto decriminalization, the modern executive compensation, which does not align the interest. It does exactly the opposite and creates a great incentive for fraud, and the way to convert money of the corporation to the personal benefit of the CEO. We've got to change that. We've got to change professional compensation, because we've seen that you can suborn the most elite auditors, appraisers, rating firms in the world to say absolute nonsense. That a CDO backed 80% by fraudulent liar's loans is a AAA. I mean, this is beyond ridiculous. So unless and until we take on those incentive systems that are so perverse, we are rolling the dice every day to have the disaster. We simply don't know what the trigger event does. And you know, we can all guess, and some of us will be right, but we didn't really know.
So you're saying that any day something could happen, boom, and we could be in another collapse.
Yes.
Well, with that, Professor Black, I will close this interview. Thank you very much for being on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you.